Good evening and welcome to the Virtual Tasting Society. I am not Verdine Perlowski. I am Jason Souter filling in tonight, and we have Aberlour. Rhymes with happy hour, the best thing I hear every place I go, and it's the one thing that actually sticks with you when you remember them. We are here with Owen Gallagher, and just grateful to have you here, and just take it away.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back. And of course, last time was Glenlivet. This time we're focusing on Aberlour, as was said. And I'll just get started. Please feel free as we go through to ask any questions about Aberlour. I'll be entirely honest off the bat. Aberlour is going through a bit of a transition phase at the moment, which we'll talk a little bit more as we're going through the tasting. But we are currently building the distillery out to have twice the capacity of production. And then on a marketing standpoint, until that project's done, we're not really pushing the brand at the moment. So the slideshow here has been pulled together by myself because there's no assets, but I'm going to try talk to every point that I would normally speak to in one of these presentations. If I omit anything or you think there's something that I have missed, as I say, please just unmute yourself, ask the question, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have throughout the duration of our tasting.
Owen,
Yes,
before we go any further, what order will we be tasting these?
we will be doing 12-year-old, followed by 16 and then 18. And then we'll have cask and am. And then we'll do the two Abunas side by side comparison at the very end. So, Aberlour is, as you can see from the screen here, founded in 1879. For those of you who were on the Glenlivet call, I'm going to rehash a few things here. But of course, Glenlivet in 1822 was demanded by King Charles IV, which opened up Highland distillation, and we saw this new boom of Scotch whisky distilleries open up in Scotland. We went from 13 legal lowland distilleries to around 130 within about 60 years. Loads of the historic names that you will have heard of, whether that be Speyside, Highland, Islay, Campbelltown, most of them came in this sort of 50-year period after 1822. Of course, Aberlour, being 1879, came right at the end of that, if not slightly outside of the pocket of that sort of Scotch whisky boom, but came right at the end, nestled in the heart of Speyside, and was one of the last distilleries to open during that period. Previous to that, though, I've jumped ahead. We're going to jump straight into the first tasting, so that when I'm talking about the history, about not only the distillery itself, but the area that it's located in, you have something nice to sample for yourself. So the first whiskey that we're going to be trying today is the Aberlour 12-year-old. Now, Aberlour is steeped in tradition and in craft. It really holds a traditional way of making Scottish whisky. Only a few parts of the distillery have been computerized and automated to this day, and most of it's still made by hand. A lot of the relations that we have through Aberlour are relations that were originally founded all the way back with our founder in 1879. A lot of the grain groups, the farms, the cooperages that we're using from Spain, we're still holding these historic ties. It allows us to pull in very high quality casks, extremely high quality barley, and barley from the local surrounding area of the distillery to ensure that we're able to deliver the highest quality product that we possibly can. So Aberlour 12 is a mix of both. It's a double oak maturation, being the classic traditional way of making Scottish whisky, with ex-bourbon barrels and ex-Oloroso sherry butts at about 500 litres for each one of them. And then, of course, we're keeping that in our distillery, in our warehouses for 12 years. Some of it will be 13, some of it will be 14, but then we're blending that together to get this array of flavours that you see in front of you. So once again, Like last time, I'm sure many of you have your own ways of drinking whiskey, your own way of sampling, but I would recommend taking the glass itself. My glass is somewhat blurred out, but you can hold the whiskey at quite a steep angle, rotate the glass around, and what you're going to find, particularly if you compare it to the likes of Glenlivet or Glenmorangie or Glenfiddich, Glenmorangie being Highland, but the other two being Speyside, is for a 12-year-old whiskey, the oil that appears on the glass actually clings and holds onto the glass for much, much longer. And there's a reason for that, which I will explain later on. But throughout the entire product line of Aberlour, you'll find that this sort of thick viscosity, this oily texture lingers throughout. It feels like a thicker liquid on the palate than most of your other Speyside whiskies. And as I said, there is a reason for that, but that comes all the way from the very beginning of the process, and a lot of what we're doing throughout the production creates this viscous texture that really helps to cling on to the flavour. It creates a more mouth coating feeling, so the flavour lasts longer. But we are using a very high percentage of Oroloso sherry casks. And when you compare the likes of Quercus alba American white oak and Quercus robur European red oak typically will give off more oil and more texture and more mouthfeel than the American white oak counterpart. So across the entire product line, when there's an age statement on the bottle, it's more likely than not that we have used a higher percentage of Oroloso sherry than we have than ex-bourbon casks, which is quite highly sought after in the whiskey industry today. And it creates an amazing flavour. As you can see, we've got this kind of tangy orange, that licorice finish that lasts for, well, several minutes after you've taken a drink. But for something of only 12 years old, the Aberlour 12 really holds this quite strong, robust flavour profile. As you can also see on the nose, you've got this sort of like sweet honey. You do get that caramel flavour coming through. I would go as far as saying like burnt sugar. You're getting that really quite rich sweetness that's coming through. The way I find is best to compare between American white oak and European red oak is you can easily say American white oak is the sort of more refreshing, summery flavors. It's vanilla, it's coconut, and it's lemon zest. While the European red oak is wintry flavors. It's cinnamon, nutmeg, chocolate, brown sugar, and you get more of these winter warmer flavors. But the best way, in my opinion, to compare between the two is American white oak is similar to like a green apple. It's really quite crisp. It's refreshing in its flavor, while the European red oak has that sharper, sweeter note, which on the nose right away, before you even take a sip, you can already pick up that sweet aroma that's coming from the Aberlour 12. And then when you go onto the taste, there's not any surprises with what you're expecting. You do get that sweet caramel flavour as well as that sort of fruity Speyside characteristic that comes through in most of our whiskies. Is anybody picking up on any flavors in this though that they'd like to point out, and I would be able to hopefully identify whether or not it's an Oroloso sherry European Quercus robur cask or an ex-bourbon Quercus Alba barrel that's bringing it through.
The first thing I tasted was orange.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the strongest flavor profiles that's coming through there. It's probably more going into your ex-bourbon Quercus Alba cask because of the sort of citrus note that's coming through with that. But it could also be described as a sweet orange, which is actually the perfect example of these two casks bringing their own flavor profiles. But rather than you sitting with you've got two sides of flavor on the palate. You've got these light and refreshing flavors and these sort of more spicy, sweet flavors. That's a perfect example of how these two casks bring their different flavors, but almost combine together to create a very unique flavor profile. Which, yeah, absolutely, right off the bat, orange is one of the top flavor profiles that comes through in the Aberlour 12.
Yeah, I know for me the biggest thing is even at 40%, it doesn't drink like 40% because I think it's that spice tingle and the way it interacts so it feels livelier on the tongue than just a straight 40.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I don't have any scientific basis for it, but I do think that sort of like oily, viscous texture that makes the liquid feel thicker really helps with that sort of initial. Particularly, I know it's like 7 p.m. for you guys, so maybe it is the first whiskey you've had today. It really gets that 40% ABV, that initial alcohol hit, that texture, that smooth, thick, viscous texture of the liquid itself really kind of covers that and smoothens that entire flavor out. So yeah, you're absolutely right there. But this is actually located right at the back of the distillery. This is called the Spey Falls, and it's where the name Aberlour actually comes from. So Aberlour is a translation of Old Scottish Gaelic to the mouth of the chattering burn, talking about where this river comes crashing down on the mossy rocks, describing the sound that it makes. And long before there was a distillery in Aberlour, which is the town the distillery is located in, long before there was even a town for that matter. If we go back hundreds and hundreds of years, we're just this site was believed to be very important and almost a religious site for the Celtic people of Scotland. So many different ceremonies and different kind of, I guess, sort of rituals were believed to have taken place here in this pool of water that's now located at the back of the distillery. To this day, the whiskey that you're currently drinking, this might sound like blasphemy when I say it, or sacrilegious even, but to this day, at the beginning of the fishing season in Speyside, the workers, the distillery workers at Aberlour will go down to the River Spey, and pour a bottle of Aberlour 12 into the River Spey to bless the waters and give the fishermen a good season of salmon fishing on the River Spey. So we still continue this sort of tradition of it being a sort of magical, important site to the overall surrounding area. And it's the distillery itself, from its founder right up to today, is a strong advocate for supporting not only the town of Aberlour itself, but the wider Speyside community, whether that's through the people who live there, the farmers, the workers, the cooperage, or even some of our rival distilleries. They're only seen as rivals in sales and marketing, but when it comes to the production side, Aberlour is always happy to help with other distilleries in the area and build that sort of Speyside whiskey community. Now, this picture here is actually the town of Aberlour itself. This is just down the road from the distillery, and that is the River Spey. It is to this day the fastest flowing body of water in Scotland. Of course, it is where the name Speyside comes from. It's on the side of the River Spey. Now, that traditionally is where the name came from, but these days the region of Speyside has continued to grow and grow its borders. So a lot of these distilleries are actually away up in the hills and disappeared into valleys and are quite numerous miles away from the river itself. But traditionally, the reason for the name Speyside is because of this river. And Aberlour is, despite being right at the end of that Scotch whisky boom, it sits right here on the river. You can walk from the distillery gates down to the side of this river in about 90 seconds. So it's in a very traditional location. And as I mentioned earlier on, this river is where we would pour the Aberlour 12 out to bless the waters for that year's fishing season. Now, I'm about to go on to the next slide, which is all about our founder, a man called John Fleming. Of course, founded the distillery in 1879, but he was a massive figure within the Aberlour community long before he opened the distillery. With that boom of Scotch whisky distilleries, he actually saw an opportunity in the business to almost try and gain a sort of Speyside monopoly on barley growth and the farmers in that area. So he became a barley trader. He would work as the middleman between farmers and between the distilleries themselves. And he worked with that for many, many years. He then moved into the town of Aberlour. During that time, opened the local bank, which is still there to this day. He was a head of the school board, and he was also a pretty renowned member of the parish in the area as well. So he became a very well-known name within the community, and through his grain growing, he became extremely his grain brokering. He became extremely successful, to the point that, as I mentioned, this is the fastest flowing body of water in the UK. Unfortunately, during John Fleming's time living in Aberlour, a very young boy fell into the river and was taken away, which of course was an emotional hit for the community. Using the money that he'd built up from brokering with the grain, he actually commissioned this bridge that you see on screen, which is Penny Bridge, still stands there to this day. It was the first bridge for miles around in the area to cross over the River Spey, and he built it with the intention that nothing like that would ever happen again. Now, the area of Aberlour, as I mentioned, goes all the way back to the Celtic people. The town itself has been there for a very, very long time. John Fleming himself, this is the only picture that exists of John Fleming, the founder of our distillery. So he wasn't one for paintings, he wasn't one for photographs, and this is what we're working with today. But John Fleming's family, the clan of Fleming, actually goes all the way back to the time of William Wallace, and his family motto, his clan's motto, was "Let the deed show." So as we're going through the tasting today, I'm going to talk about how we continue to do that, the idea of him building that bridge for the community, maintaining these strong relations with the town, was all kind of in line with this "Let the deed show," and we continue to try and push that today through our practice in the distillation of making whiskey. So the next whiskey that we have is Aberlour 16. Now, side by side with the Aberlour 12, if you do have more than one glass in front of you, I'd highly recommend trying these two side by side. They're both matured in a very similar fashion. They're both double oak matured. Once again, we've ramped up that sherry count slightly more. But in my personal opinion, I think this is one of the best in the entire industry, one of the best examples of how much flavour you can really pull out from a double oak maturation. So it's like that 12, it's been ramped up. You're getting more of the spice, more of the sweetness coming through, but it's an extremely strong flavour. In fact, when as a company, we own 13 distilleries in Speyside, and many of the distillers who work even at other distilleries, whether that be Glenlivet or Longmorn or Strathila, very, very frequently, the Aberlour 16 is quoted to be a lot of people's favourites. Now, that texture, that thicker, velvety texture that we had on the 12, is coming through even stronger here. That's due, in fact, because of that extra sherry cask that's coming through. Now, if going once again back to the Glenlivet presentation I done a few months ago, the way that we describe Speyside flavours is through the three F's of Speyside. So it's fresh, floral, and fruity. Aberlour ticks all of these off, but if we compare it to Glenlivet, its sister distillery, Glenlivet is producing like pineapple and lemon zest and coconut and very quite light tropical fruity flavours. Aberlour is doing like dried fruits and figs and dates. So it still holds within that fresh floral and fruity category, but it's quite a far step from that almost traditional flavour profile that was coming through. So I'm sure many of you have been to Scotland, or you've seen pictures maybe through these tastings of the inside of distilleries. And when you see the inside of a Speyside distillery, it's almost always these very, very tall, thin, narrow stills. And that's how they're producing these light, tropical flavour notes that come through. Aberlour, if we want to really make a comparison here, most of the Speyside stills are tall and thin like ballerinas. I'm taking someone else's metaphor here. Well, Aberlour is like the stocky rugby player. It's short, it's stout. It doesn't have this very long journey for the vapor to travel over, so that you're only getting that light, refreshing, fruity flavour profile. But we're getting a lot of the oil that in these taller stills, the heavier vapor would never have reached the top to carry that oily texture through, and it allows that to pass over the top of the Aberlour stills, giving us a slightly darker flavour profile with these more winter fruit flavours that are coming through. So then when you take the double oak maturation, the European oak sherry for specifically, we're already working with a sort of like almost spicy dried fruit spirit when it's clear and it looks like water. So for us to then bring over the cinnamon, the nutmeg, the clove, the brown sugar, the marzipan flavors that come with the European red oak casks, it works hand in hand with the spirit that we're actually producing within Aberlour Distillery. And as I say, at the moment we are pushing that to try and double the production of the Aberlour's output. So as you'll see here, we've got the floral, the spicy, you've got that soft plum. That could even be argued that it's coming from the spirit itself, but it's definitely been heightened by the Oroloso sherry casks. And then you will, as we're getting older, of course, as it always goes, you've got that sort of gentle oakiness that's coming through. That's always present. And as you move up through these ages, you're always going to end up getting slightly more tannins, slightly more dry, peppery notes, which is definitely present here, particularly if you compare it side by side with the 12-year-old. When we're actually producing not just Aberlour, but almost all of our whiskies, the way that we avoid making something like an 18, a 20, 21, 25-year-old whiskey not overly bearing with that oaky, dry, sort of peppery flavour is the way that our blending team do that. That is why in our warehouses we have casks that have went through 2 or 3 types. When we do a second fill or a third fill, on the first and second time round, more and more of those tannins have been stripped out of the barrel so that when we go back in next time, our whiskey has been soaked into the barrel as well as some of those minerals in the different oils that are inside the wood that give us the amazing flavour. But we are stripping away those tannins, and that is in our older whiskies. I was surprised to find out that we actually use more refill casks than we do first fill in the older the whiskey, because then that allows us to really limit that sort of dry, oaky flavour. So once again, in this one compared to the 12, you're able to taste that oaky, dry flavour that's coming through. But that isn't there purely because it's old. It's also there because the blending team have deliberately allowed it to remain present, to give that texture on the back of the palate, that sort of peppery, dry spiciness that comes through. It adds a bit of warmth, which I think people are always expecting when it comes to Scotch whisky, particularly as we're entering into the winter months of the year. And it really gives that sort of viscous, oily texture that Aberlour has. When you swallow the whiskey, you can still feel it left behind inside your mouth on the palate. That sort of dry oakiness definitely comes through and lingers for a lot longer.
The nose
Trent, you had a
on
question. You want to come off mute?
the nose on this is amazing, by the way. Really enjoy it.
An incredible aroma right off the bat. This one's again quite different to the 12 though. I find that the nose doesn't quite align with the flavour as well. Like they are both incredible, the flavour and the smell. But it's almost like a bit more of a surprise when you go from the smell. It is quite light and floral and on the nose itself. And then when you take that first sip, that oily texture comes back, and you end up getting these much sweeter, more spicier flavors rather than that light, laid back floral expectation, I guess you would have after just taking the nose. I do see we've got a few things in the chat here. Is there any questions?
Yeah, two questions for you. One is you're talking about building out your distillery to double production.
Yes.
Are you looking at trying to match your house style and getting similar stills and fermentation
Yeah.
tanks and so on? Or are
So
you
the
trying to experiment with new production methods?
No, so the idea will be it will be exactly the same. Pretty much, we've got the still house as it is at the moment. It sits with 4 stills inside, and we produce roughly 4.2 million liters a year. The goal is this is a very old building. It's been there for since like the early 1900s when it was first built. We then in 1970s put in the second set of stills into that building, which already made it far more cramped than you would expect it to, than I guess ideally you would want it to be. So the new project is to pretty much almost copy and paste that over into a brand new building, but the shape of the stills will be exactly the same as they were in the old building. The mash tun will be the same. Both buildings will actually share the same mill, so the grist is coming from the same milling process as well. And from that point of milling, the grist will split in two. In one, it takes about 90 minutes to 2 hours to do a whole mash tun of grist, and then the mash tun takes 6 hours. So at the moment, that mill does like 2 hours of work, and then it sits dormant for 4 hours while the mash tun's
Mm.
picking up on all those sugars. We can now split it in two and do 4 hours of milling and have two mash tuns running at the same time. Means it only sits dormant for about 2 hours in total.
Got it. And then the 16, are you guys using older barrels on these? Because it seems like the volume is turned down on the flavors, but the it's much more delicate and
Yeah,
precise with the flavor notes.
yeah. So that absolutely that's where that sort of refill second and third fill cask comes in. Aberlour 12 is really quite punchy and powerful on the flavour, while this is definitely more subtle. However, the using the refill casks and getting that kind of more subtle flavour note allows for this to be one of these whiskies that almost every time you drink it, you might taste something slightly different. So it allows for far more I guess, flavors that would be definitely pushed to the background if, say, we had used 80% first fill barrels and 20% second and third fill, we would have once again a very strong, punchy, powerful flavor, while the kind of background flavors would definitely be drowned out. But because we've used these casks, about 60% of them have went through the Aberlour warehouse at least once before. Some of them have went through twice. We actually use casks up to 5 times, but that's very, very rare for us to use a fifth one. Being in the, I used to work at Glenlivet and in the warehousing of these distilleries, and we have a coded system. So if it's first fill, the top of the cask is painted white. If it's second, it's blue. If it's third, it's yellow. If it's fourth, it's green. And if it's fifth, it's red. I worked there for about 18 months, and I think in total I probably saw under 10 red tops to the cask. So we're very, very rarely using a cask 5 times. However, if on the first fill it was massively powerful in flavour and super, super strong, that's obviously that flavour profile is going to last much longer, so we can use it over and over again. If we're using a cask 5 times, though, it's far more likely to go into a non-age statement, for instance. So, like what we'll get onto later, like the cask and Am, an Aberlour or Abuna, it could be used as one of the younger whiskies, and that on one of its first time rounds. So it's not that it's went round the warehouse 5 times and the minimum age statement is 12. So then it's been like, that's way too quick a math for me, 60 years that it spends inside the warehouse. Like for a lot of these, like especially on the first ones when they've got this extremely strong, powerful, punchy flavour, we'll be going into something like a Buna or Cask and Am at a smaller percentage. Maybe on their third, fourth, fifth times, we might be holding it for the 12 and 16 because that really strong, powerful, punchy flavour has now been toned back significantly, but we can still add it into something, particularly like the 16, as you explained. It does have that sort of subtle complexity to it, and it allows those more like laid back flavors to kind of come to the forefront of the palate. So there's a lot of different elements going on here, but the 16 is about 60% refill casks. I can't, of course, say for certain if there is anything as old as 5 times going around, but that same theory will be used even if it's the third or fourth time. It was still probably a very strong, powerful flavour in its first time round, and they were deliberately holding them to create this like complex, wide array of flavour profile that we get through the 16.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody else got it. I was getting a familiar smell and I had to sit there for a while on the 16. And finally, I think it's a charcuterie board of like fig jam, dried apricot. There's a little bit of almost like the rind of Parmesan, that little salinity. Like there's a bunch of little notes in your brain, and if you put them all together, it's like it just kind of makes it familiar. But like when you go to sip on it, the first thing you just hit with is just mulling spices, and it's deeper and richer and fruitier.
That is the first time I've heard charcuterie board be used as a flavour profile, but actually, as you said it, I was able to, yeah, like you're actually right when that first arrives with all the chutneys and jams. You're definitely getting that flavour through, which I personally can't atone to American white oak or European red oak. That's definitely a mix of the two
Mhm.
that's coming through there. But I'm going to steal that. I'm going to put that in my presentation at some point in the future. A charcuterie board for the Aberlour 16. Move on to it. So, as I mentioned, Aberlour is extremely traditional in the way that we make. This is the still house itself. As you can tell, some parts of it are newer than others, but the inside is all, yeah, pretty much run by hand to this day. Something like the mill that I mentioned earlier on that will run for about 2 hours. The It's actually the distiller. So in the process of making whiskey, we have milling, uh, mashing, fermentation, distillation, maturation, and blending. It's actually the distiller at stage 4 who runs the mill at Aberlour. So they're always constantly monitoring the stills, controlling the heat, making sure that the flow of spirit is going at the right rate and the pressure inside is exactly where it should be so that we're getting that exact flavour profile that we want. We also, of course, want it to come out originally at about 150 proof. That middle cut will then run for about 3 to 3.5 hours, and slowly is going to come down on alcohol as we're pulling alcohol out of the still. But during that time, they're also controlling the mill. So traditionally, that would have been the job of mashman, but they are with the computerization of the mill, it really allows the stillman head down, turn on the mill, make sure in the first couple of minutes that it's running properly, and then after that is pretty much computer run. After milling, mashing is 100% done by hand. It's all the grist is brought through, the water is brought through, the controlling of the temperature of the 3 washes of water, which I only know in Celsius, but 63, 77, and 93 degrees Celsius are the 3 washes of water that pour through the mash tun, and that's all done by hand. Then the complete draining of this vat of the sugary water, the wort that we get, into wooden washbacks inside the Aberlour stillhouse. Once again, done by hand, and once we reach fermentation, we have nothing to do with it. We don't use any enzymes to speed up the fermentation. There's no insulation in the tanks to maintain temperature, and there's no heating equipment. We put the sugary water in, we add in a liquid yeast, and we leave it for about 2.5 days. And it, of course, becomes our wash, our 8.5% flat beer. It's very, very bitter. There's no carbonation. There's no flavors added to it. If you were in a bar and you went in and you ordered a beer and it tasted like this, I guarantee you would not order it again. It's not very nice at all. But of course, we take that wash beer onto our distillation. Now, distillation itself, as I mentioned earlier on, is one of the most important parts of the entire process, particularly here at Aberlour, because it's quite a unique shape for a Speyside still. As I previously mentioned, they're quite short and they're stubby, but if you notice the bottom of them as well, it's not a deep dish or like a bucket shape on the bottom. It's almost that of a saucer, which means the liquid inside is very, very shallow. It allows for quicker evaporation, more vapors traveling up through that still much quicker, and it's causing for more of that heavy, oilier liquids to come through during distillation, giving us once again those sort of winter dried fruit flavors that are coming through.
It
If you can,
also,
oh, go
sorry,
ahead.
it also looks like you have pretty good contact with the copper, which
Yeah,
would
absolutely.
take out some of that sulfur, and
Yeah,
that's why you don't have the funk that a lot of the shorter stills typically have.
yeah, absolutely. So we haven't added in any bottleneck or boiling bowl in the center of the still, which of course would cause an influx, which gets a lot rid of a lot of the sulfur, but also gives us a lot of esters. But with the time that it actually spends inside there, going up and over the top, and just the shape of the still, you're absolutely right on the fact that the journey that the vapor's taking, it's almost constantly in contact with that copper piping, both in first distillation and in second distillation, which you'll see the middle two here are first, going from our 8.5% to 25%, and then the two very slightly smaller stills, you can definitely see it more on the right hand one, is our second distillation going from 25% ABV up to 75%. Particularly in the second distillation, we're going to gain much more copper contact because the actual, as you can very slightly see, the neck coming out of the saucer has more of an angle on it, so it causes more pressure and more of that vapor to be funneled through the neck of the still, well, the wash still quite a gradual slope into the neck, so it's almost a much more natural journey that the vapor takes. So yeah, once we come to the end of distillation, we end up with this very, very spicy, dried fruit, wintry flavor. Of course, as it's coming over, because they are so short, these are only about 6.5 meters tall. The vapors coming over the top is carrying that thick liquid. That actually requires a lot more cleaning on our side because of this thick, oily liquid that's coming through the piping, coming through the spirit safe. It means we actually have to shut down the entire production to clean both the inside of the still for that. And I forget the chemical scientific name, but that kind of blue residue that comes out when we remove the sulfur using the copper. We need to clear that out more often, and then we need to do a full water run to clear out all of those oils that were stuck inside during distillation. So it creates an amazing flavor, but it definitely comes with a bit more effort to keep these stills running the way that they have. And I believe in the new distillery there has been countermeasures made to ensure that we're still getting that oiliness coming through, but there's ways that we've improved this process of completely emptying all the stills and cleaning out the pipe work inside. As well as that, though, the actual barley grain that we're taking in from the local area goes all the way back to John Fleming himself. When he was this grain broker, he established relations with the local farms, and now there's a group called the Banff and Murray Grain Group, which was originally John Fleming and someone else's grain groups that then joined together much later on. But today, the production of that barley is used exclusively for Aberlour and Glenlivet. But Glenlivet pulls in its barley from 90 miles outside of the distillery. These two distilleries are about 8 miles apart. Aberlour is even closer, and it's able to pull in all of the barley for its production within 30 miles of the distillery. So that's extremely impressive in Speyside, where it's only 40 miles squared with 52 distilleries. And from if you jump in a car at Aberlour, you can drive to Glenfiddich and Balvenie and Macallan under 15 minutes. Some of the biggest names in the industry are right next door to Aberlour, And to this day, they're able to continually pull in these grains from the local community, supporting those farmers, but also allowing us to continue using the same barley that we have since, or the same source of the barley since 1879.
Have
Kate, I
you
think so.
have you ever tried any other types of grains? The thing I was going to ask
Yeah,
when you talked about all the maintenance was, have you ever tried rye? Because that would be, I would think you already have maintenance issues. Rye would be a nightmare.
yeah.
But it sounds like you stick with the barley, just
Yeah.
barley, and just
So from
a short distance away.
it's exclusive. We exclusively actually use malted barley to produce Aberlour's whiskey, but we do that purely because within the Scotch Whisky Association's rules and guidelines for how to make particularly single malt Scotch whisky, it has to be only malted barley. As a company, though, we do actually use rye in one of our distilleries called Strathclyde, which is our grain whiskey distillery. So we're able to use a variety of grains. But unfortunately, Aberlour is, as a single malt distillery, is restricted to the use of only malted barley. But we end up, yeah, you're absolutely right. The idea of using rye in one of these stills does sound like an absolute nightmare. And of course, there was many innovations made in the bourbon industry to try and mitigate that. The Scotch Whisky Association actually set rules in about the 1950s that prevented us from using any other type of still than a pot still, which of course has its own flavour. It has the journey of vapor, it has the influx that's going into it. But at that time, there was a few distilleries, one of them being called Dumbarton Distillery, that had now started to use the column still or the coffee still. And this is when these rules came into play. So within the grain whiskey and blended Scotch category, coffee and column stills are still totally legal and they can be used to produce that spirit. But within single malt, it has to be these copper pot stills, which of course does bring a benefit of flavour. It brings a benefit of texture as well, but they are highly inefficient. Of course, with column stills, they can run continuously day in, day out without ever needing to refresh them. These stills, we fill them with about 18,500 litres of liquid in the first distillation. Once we do that, it runs for about 3.5 hours. Once we get to the point that we've pulled all of the alcohol out of that cask, so 3.5 hours it runs. What runs through during that 3.5 hours will run into the next distillation. We also have a final 2 hours at the end where what's under a certain threshold of alcohol will go into a storage backup tank. And then next time it will be mixed with the wash beer and go through distillation for a second time again. So we're always reusing, we don't let anything go to waste. But it does require us to then completely empty 18,500 litres of liquid, refill it, which has now been sitting in a tank for several hours. So it comes in cold, and we're using heat exchangers of the hot liquid coming out and the cold liquid going in at the same time to try and lower the energy that's required for us to conduct the distillation. But again, once you actually finish a distillation, you're probably talking about 2.5 hours of work to completely empty them, refill them, get them back up to heat so that you've got vapor coming through again, and then you end up back on that middle cut of spirit. So unlike the column stills, there is like quite a lot of downtime between each run and each distillation. So yeah, me
With
personally,
this
oh
with the stills being so short and fat, the even though the line arm is flat,
yeah.
it's extremely long for being because of having to make up all that space. Do you have a
Yeah,
problem of like the actual condensation like pooling in the bottom of that line arm, or is there enough actual movement that it keeps it moving?
so I think a very good question that I don't have the exact answer to, but my understanding of why the line arm is so flat is that once that heavy vapor does make the journey over the swan neck and it's now in the line arm, it's not going to, if it was slightly raised, of course, it would go through the line arm very quickly. If it's slightly lower, you do get more of the condensation, but it runs down. But by maintaining it very straight, the vapor almost has to push itself along inside the line arm, so it's not ever free flowing, and it gives it just more copper contact and more of that ester count that actually comes during the line arm part of the distillation as well. And I'm trying. I feel like I've yeah. So I was trying. There's underneath these stills, we have a new innovation within the Scotch whisky industry that we came up with about 5 years ago. Inside the whiskey industry, we've used TVR for a long time, which is thermal vapor recompression, and it's to basically reheat the stills as we're emptying them with the water vapor that comes during condensation inside the condensers, which are conveniently placed behind this wall in this picture, and it allows us to reduce the heat that we're using, or the energy we're using to heat the stills. Underneath these stills now, we have what's called mechanical vapor recompression. It has been used in the oil industry for decades, and we kind of noticed it a few years ago and decided to try and implement it into Aberlour distillery and now several of our other distilleries as well. The basic difference between TVR and MVR, or mechanical vapor recompression, is underneath the stills, we have these huge boxes that are filled with turbines, so that when the vapor goes through, they push the turbines and it actually heats up the vapor itself through the travel, through this MVR contraption. And then we redirect this newly heated vapor directly onto the bottom of the stills. By doing this, in the initial tests that we ran at Aberlour, we were able to reduce the energy required to heat up these stills by about 45 to 50%, which was a massive achievement at the time. Now, one of our distilleries, which is called Glen Talkers, which goes mainly into the blend of Ballantine's and Ballantine's Finest, has actually managed to replicate that, but up at 85% of the energy is now being saved through the distillation process as well. But that initially started here at Aberlour. Another sort of innovation that they've came up with at Aberlour is we've started to work with people in the North Sea, where under the North Sea they have these huge empty pockets of where gas was drilled out over the many decades. One of the main issues with whisky making today, particularly on an environmentally friendly point of view, of course, is the carbon dioxide that's naturally produced during fermentation. We're now working with these people to capture that carbon dioxide and repurpose these pockets under the North Sea to be able to fill them with our carbon dioxide as well. So that's still in the works, but that's currently running at Aberlour Distillery at the moment. Is there I'm going to move on, but this is sort of the end of the production piece. Does anybody have any questions on the production? No. Excellent. Okay. So now we have Aberlour 18. This is a bit of a leap compared to the last two that we've tried, because once again it is double oak matured, an ex-bourbon and Oloroso sherry, but this time we're really going in to highlight the relationship that we have with the bodegas and the sherry makers in Spain. We've managed to hold on to a strong relation with several of these bodegas and vineyards, to ensure that the sherry casks that we're getting, our blending team actually go down to Spain once a year, 3 members out of the 6 that are in the blending team, to hand select these casks from these sherry bodegas. And the 18-year-old is a real testament to what that can achieve in our liquid itself. Right off the bat, on the nose, you are going to get these sort of, well, it says here orange zest, but you get that toffee, that plum, that dried fruit. You can even kind of smell that licorice flavour that's coming through as well. And then once again, you kind of get that sharp, burnt brown sugar flavour that comes through. Now, this is because we've not just used ex-bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks to produce this, but we take the ex-bourbon and Oloroso sherry, blend them together after 18 years, and we leave it for about 6 months in a large vat that's about 22,000 litres of Aberlour 18. We leave it for 6 months so that Quercus alba natural oils and the Quercus robur oils can compete against each other and fuse and balance out so that, that every part of that whiskey tastes exactly the same. We then take two different portions of that 22,000 litres. We put one portion of it back into Oloroso sherry casks for 18 months. These are always first fill on this point, so we're really looking for that strong, punchy, powerful sherry dynamic that would give. And then also we have our PX Pedro Jimenez sherry, which of course, if there are any sherry drinkers in the call, is regarded as one of, if not the sweetest sherry that you can get in the sherry industry. At one end of the scale, you have your Pinot, which is the driest sherry possible. Oloroso sits right in the centre there, and then PX is on the other end. That's Pedro Jimenez sherry, and it really does just bring through that incredible, sharp, sweet. This is like the kind of whiskey that people would describe as Christmas cake in a bottle. You do get that kind of chocolate bitterness that comes through at the end, and an incredible dessert whiskey. You'll see on the palate part here as well. Once again, that sort of apricot flavour, you're probably noticing a pattern here with the oranges and the apricots that have been coming through on loads and loads of these whiskies. Our master blender, Sandy Islop, does describe the 18-year-old as that sort of. I guess this kind of goes back to the charcuterie board tasting as well, but he describes it as a homemade jam or jelly that you would that's been made, preserved in a cupboard, and when you first open, you get that strong aroma of that sweet fruit that's been fermenting in that jam for well, however long you held it for. But that is one of the best flavor notes that I've heard someone, and of course, it did come from our master blender, so you would expect it to be. But he said that right away. And then every time that I drink the Aberlour 18, that's kind of always that rings in the back of my head. Now, of course, a big part of my job is the power of auto suggestion. So by having these flavors in front of you, perhaps you're smelling it, perhaps you're tasting it, and you're reading these, and you're able to pick up on them. But as we've already had a few people call out some other flavor notes, it is always a personal journey, a personal experience, and everyone's going to pick up on something slightly different. So me personally, I can definitely think of other whiskies that have more of a nutty almond or nutmeg, as you can see here, or that sort of like dry, earthy tone that comes through. I feel like there are stronger advocates for that than the Aberlour 18, but we do get that sort of cinnamon, clove, that warm spice, and then that lingers with you for so long after you swallow the whiskey, which is once again testament to how much oil an Oloroso sherry Quercus robur cask can bring through just purely through that maturation, particularly because we're doing the first fill Oloroso sherry casks that are coming through. It allows all of that natural oil to pass through into our whiskey, and we get one of the most award-winning Aberlour whiskies that we have, and a relatively new addition to the Aberlour core range. Previously, we had an 18 that followed in the footsteps of the 12 and the 16 with its double oak maturation. For us to now go in and start doing finishes, this was a relatively new thing for Aberlour to start doing. About 4 years, well, 5 years ago now actually, we released this Aberlour 18, which definitely holds its place as one of my favourites. Yeah, you'll find right off the bat you do get that sort of that chocolatey flavour that takes in definitely the side. You get that milk chocolate flavour that's coming through. On here it's chocolate covered raisins, but I feel that you can definitely separate the two flavour notes into that sort of dried fruit, warm, spicy flavour, and and that chocolate flavour that lasts for way after the whiskey has actually left your mouth.
Yeah, the nose I was reminded of the old chocolate amaretto cherries my grandmother used to have. And then on the palate, it's a different chocolate though. It's a richer, fattier chocolate. And that one especially, there's almost, I want to say it's almost like a little chalky dry on the finish. Is just there's so much of kind of I think it's the actual wood itself, and those tiny little remnants of it.
Yeah, I think that like it does have a very quite dry finish. There's almost this moment in the finish that once you drink the whiskey, you feel like you know what the finish is going to be like, and then after about 5 6 seconds, like the really strong finish almost drops, and you're left with this very very subtle finish. It's almost at like the sides, for me anyway, the sides of your palate that you're able to kind of continue. And I think that's where a lot of the chocolatey flavor comes through, is that like lasting flavor that sits there after that initial strong finish kind of dissipates slightly. So this is one of our cruises. In Scotland today. There's actually 146 individual single malt distilleries, all producing their own whiskey. Now, there's of course 100 ways you can do this to create different flavors. Amazingly, though, there are only two cooperages in the entirety of Scotland. The one that we use, again, is only within about 20 miles of Aberlour, so still very local to where we are. They'll supply most of the Speyside distilleries in the Northern Highlands, and then there's another cooperage down kind of in the southwest, but mainland Scotland, that will help with Islay and Campbelltown and a lot of the lowland distilleries. What's really impressive to this day, though, is despite the fact that there's only these two cooperages, it's all still made by hand. These people are they're working in price work, so they get paid per cask that they make. If you ever do visit Scotland and you go up to Speyside, you can actually go in and view the cooperage from above, and you'll see these people creating these casks at incredible speeds. But the two different casks that we're using for the majority of what we're producing here, of course, is ex bourbon and Oloroso sherry. When we get bourbon barrels, they're actually brought to Scotland from the US on planes. The bourbon industry will, of course, remove the bourbon from inside. They then break apart the bourbon cask and will really quite strain almost all of the excess bourbon that's held inside the grain before sending it over on a plane as staves and bonds, but not as whole casks. Then, when they arrive in Scotland, it is the job of the coopers to rebuild these bourbon barrels. Now, that's technically not true because a barrel is 190 litres. In Scotland, well, in Kentucky, of course, they have 8 9 month summers, extreme angel share of like 9, 12, even 15%. In Scotland, our summers last for about 3 days, so we have nowhere near the same problem going on there. And we're able to get about 1.5 to 2% evaporation per year. So when we bring in 10 bourbon barrels from the US, we actually sacrifice one of the 10 and put those wooden staves into the other 9, bringing that total volume up to about 250 litres per American white oak cask. So we technically wouldn't call that a barrel, we call it a hogshead because it's a different size and different volume to a barrel, and these are all hogsheads that you see in front of you. So they would be originally built at somewhere like the Speyside Cooperage. Usually at this point, most of the distilleries won't have claim to certain barrels because all of these have came from the US. They've all came from the same source. The bourbon's been strained out, and they'll be kind of distributed among the Speyside distilleries. Of course, once we've used it a second and a third time, that's now been marked with our spirit. It's soaked in the likes of the flavours of Aberlour, so we're then not going to send that off to Strath or to Macallan or to someone else. At that point, that then becomes our cask. But that's how we're creating these American white oak casks when they first arrive here in Scotland. After that, they can stay in the warehouse 5 times without ever returning to the cooperage unless one of our warehousemen detect any damage on it, if one of the bonds slips, if there's a leak, and at which point, if there's a leak, that's actually a different story. It will most likely be turned so that the leak is facing up the way, and it will be reported to the distillery manager. But for once that damage is there, once that cask is empty, it will be returned to the cooperage, and by hand once again they will mend it, and it will be sent back to us at the distillery. Now that's one of our cooperages. The next picture, of course, is actually one of the bodegas in Spain where they're holding the sherry casks. These casks are a completely different story, and especially with Aberlour, we have such a focus on the sherry butts that are coming from Spain. They're 500 litres, so they're huge, but they're not flattened out and sent over to us in Scotland and rebuilt in the cooperage. We actually have 3 months in the entire year that we are able to transport these casks to Scotland because they're shipped with the sherry inside on boats in large cargo containers. These cargo containers, of course, are metal. So if we were to do it in July, June, August from Spain to Scotland, admittedly, by the time you get to the Scotland part, it's probably not too warm. But in the Spanish leg of that heat inside these containers can spoil the oak, or it can cause a lot of damage and dry out the oak, causing for leaking to happen. So we only ever ship these during the winter months. We have about 3 to 4 months to get the entire inventory of sherry casks for the next year into Scotland. And they won't visit the cooperage when they arrive unless necessary. But usually they'll come straight to one of the filling halls that we have in Speyside, and pretty much almost immediately be filled with spirit once they arrive and put into the warehouse for their first time round. Does anyone have any questions on our warehousing, our cooperage, or our relation with the sherry casks? I didn't really touch on warehousing. We don't. We have 3 warehouses on the site of the distillery. The rest of it is stored off-site in numerous locations across Speyside. We do have one very, very large site called Mulben, where we store about 4.8 million barrels of whiskey. And that will hold Glenlivet, it will hold Aberlour, it will hold Strathisla, that will go on to be Chivas Regal. But that's where we hold almost all of our brands in this one huge warehousing site, where a lot of our distilleries now have sort of sacrificed the space that once used to be used for warehouses. In fact, in the terms of Aberlour, that space that was then made was a big part of what's now allowed us to build this brand new stillhouse. So we're in a very interesting area of Scotland because it's not ran by the government or the local council, but it's very old and traditional in the fact that there's one man who lives in a castle down the road from Aberlour, and he's actually the lord of all the land, and he has final say on everything. And every one of the distilleries in that area, which includes us and some of our competitors, have all pretty much been grounded to the footprint that we have. So we had to generate space on our distillery site to be able to build this new development of the new Aberlour distillery. Now, we've got cask in am. As we're going through the next part of the tasting, I'm going to really encourage you to sample these kind of together. Now, starting with cask in am, this is a traditional way of making whiskey. When we add water and bring it down to 40% ABV or 80 proof, that only really became the way of making whiskey when we started doing a lot more international shipping, particularly due to planes. The altitude of the whiskey would cause the whiskey to land in another country, and the liquid itself would have become cloudy. So we only started adding water and bringing whiskey down below 48% ABV when we started using the planes to transport our whiskey across the world. Of course, we then were able to start transporting whiskey that's above 48%, but that's when we started needing to do unchill filtered products. If it's above 48% and it's unchill filtered, you won't get any of that cloudiness if you add any water, because it's above 48%. If you take any of these whiskies that we're now about to try, and you have a water dropper or a glass of water next to you, enjoy the whiskey as it is. But if you want a bit of a science experiment, add water to it, and once it because it's all the three of these are unchilled filtered, once it drops below 48%, you will see the amino acids and the proteins start to react, and it'll take on a more cloudy appearance, and that's because it's unchill filtered. Anything below 48% these days is usually chill filtered to avoid any sort of like altitude or water changing the appearance of the whiskey during transport. So this is a traditional way of making whiskey because we're not adding any water to it. It is double oak matured once again using an ex-bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks to produce that flavour. This time round though, the 12-year-old, the 16-year-old were both 40%. The 18 is 43%. And this one, I'm not sure if Jason, if you have the bottles with you. Oh, have we got, is it 48? 49? 48. So it is right on that margin of the unchill filtration. So these come out in batches. Each batch can be slightly different in its ABV as well. Same with the next two whiskies that we're going to try, the two Abunas, as their batch release, they come out with slight variations in the ABV. Once again, though, Cask and Am is one of the better examples of what Aberlour strives to create. We once again have that follow through of the orange flavour coming through. We are getting that sort of winter berry, the cherries, the dried fruits, the raisins, the dates that are coming through, and you do get that warm, spicy aroma that lingers for a very, very long time after you've swallowed the whiskey. Now, the actual bottle itself, though, you'll notice, is slightly different because it's got a wax top. All of the bottles that we've used so far in this process have been of this short, stubby shape, which has become more and more common within the whiskey industry in the last couple of years. But if you go back 20 years ago, almost every single malt whiskey was tall and thin in its bottle. The reason that we created this bottle that you see here is in 1978, when we were actually putting in the second set of stills into the distillery, they knocked down a wall, and inside the wall they found a time capsule, and they don't know when it was from, but they dated it to late 1800s. And the bottle that they found was of this design. Now, the embossed glass with the name is a creative liberty that we've added ourselves, but this short, stubby bottle with the wax seal on the top is what they found, and then we built the entire brand around that story. So this, yeah, it's an incredible whiskey. It's quite rare to find, especially here in the US, but it can be found in certain retailers. But deliberately made to sort of shine a light and harken back to the old traditional way of making Scotch whiskey. As I mentioned throughout, Aberlour always honed back to this traditional way of making whiskey. We're trying to up the production, but without making the entire process far too modernized. And this is the perfect example of a product that actually would have been made in that same style 50 to 100 years ago before we started shipping a lot of our Scotch whiskey overseas. So with that being 48%, it is a bit of a jump onto our next whiskey, which is the Aberlour Abunas. Now, with the Abunas, I would highly recommend trying them side by side. The reason I'm saying this is because throughout this tasting, we've had a double oak maturation for a lot of these expressions. Aberlour is very unique as a brand. So Aberlour Abuna translates into the mouth of the chattering burn being Aberlour, but Abuna translates into original. So this harpens back to that bottle that was found in the wall, the original Aberlour bottle that we're striving to create. And then Alba translates into white, which is of course Quercus alba, American white oak casks that we're using. This is the only bottle that Aberlour has ever created that is 100% ex-American bourbon Quercus Alba cask. So there's absolutely no sherry in there. It makes a really, really unique whiskey, particularly when you take that strong, thick, viscousy flavour that comes from the distillation, that sort of like dried fruits, figs, pears, dates, all these kind of flavours that are coming through. To then partner that with only ex bourbon barrels creates this almost composition of two different flavors. And because it's not two different oils and casks coming through right off the bat, it's not going to merge. Like, it doesn't matter how long we leave it in that large vat at 22,000 litres. That is the raw base flavor of the spirit and the base flavor of these oils from the American white oak. And it does create this really interesting, like, almost battle between these two flavors within the whiskey itself. As I say, it's the only time that we've ever done this. It's quite, once again, quite new. It arrived in market roughly around the same time as the new Aberlour 18 in 2019, so 6 years ago. The Abuna Alba was released, and it's released in batches. So once again, I might need to ask you, UK, if you have the bottle there, for which one that the percentage of what we have on this. But usually, because I'm not sure what batch was sent over to Vadim, but usually we're looking at about 59.3. So I was going to say between about 58 and 61. So we're right in the middle ground there. Please, once again, as we're going through, if you are you may be a real fan of cask strength whiskies, but especially if there's any bourbon drinkers. Of course, there's usually a stronger proof in bourbon. But I would always definitely recommend try it a few times on its own, but particularly with these cask strengths where the oil has never interacted with water, it's never been broken down. I would always recommend add a wee drop of water and it will break down that layer of oil that appears in the glass when you spin it around. That's not just a layer across the top of the whiskey, but rather it's like a bubble around the entire liquid. And if you add a drop of water in there, it bursts that bubble, it mixes the oil around more evenly. And I don't quite know what it means, but it causes the amino acids and proteins inside the glass to react quicker, which is why you get such a heightened flavour and smell to the whiskey as well. And sometimes it can totally shift the flavour and smell as well. So I would definitely recommend with Abuna Alba and Abuna, try it a few times on its own, and then add a wee bit of water and see if you can notice the shift in flavour.
Yeah, these are so I've already tried them side by side, and these are wildly different from the other ones.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
um I guess I understand what you're saying. They have not been mixed.
yeah. So
And so
it's
they haven't,
interesting.
right. They don't have any other influence. And I wonder if we had started with these. So I'm going to save some and I'm going to experiment tomorrow night. But I wonder if we had started with these, how I would feel about them. But when I taste them now, it's like, no, I have to add water. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
they,
yeah. Because
they
we've
just
had so
don't
many.
work. Right.
Yeah,
They just don't work for me. But I wonder if I started with these, because I enjoy casks, right?
yeah.
If I would like them, you
Yeah,
know.
so because we went from like the 80 proof and we've jumped up to what 118 roughly. You think the jump might be what's caused?
Well, but also the whole, the head game of,
Yeah,
these things are well mixed and they're smooth and everything else, and then you get to these two and they're
yeah,
much more in
absolutely.
your face, and I don't know how much of that um is the fact that the one is only bourbon casks, no sherry.
Yeah.
Uh, how much of it is the alcohol, the ABV, and
So
at
I,
any
I,
rate,
I
yeah,
definitely would find it more with the ex bourbon barrel one particularly
yeah.
because it has less of that oil. And we've definitely became more used to the oil through the tasting because there's such a high percentage of European red oak in all of the other bottles that we've tried tonight.
Yeah. What about the Abuna?
So the Abuna's the opposite end. The Abuna's 100% Oloroso sherry,
Okay.
matured, so there's no bourbon. So it's quite a unique thing within the Scotch whisky industry for a brand. You can try the 12 and the 16, but then if you get the two Abunas side by side, you've almost got the base ingredients that the blending team would have brought into the lab when they blend the 16 and 18. So if you are to experiment, as you say, with tomorrow night, if you do start with them, it's quite interesting that when you try these two side by side and then go back and try something like the 16, you can almost hone in exactly on what wood and what oak is responsible for those different flavors and aromas that are appearing inside the glass. So it's like it breaks down the building blocks for it and really allows you to identify how we're creating these different flavors.
It'd be really interesting if they did a third version that was just red oak, because then you've got everything. Then you can even blend your own. But there's another Speyside group that for the first time they did the opposite. They did 100% sherry cask instead of their normal mix, and it's the same thing as you notice something missing from the thing that you loved, and it's not good or bad. It's just all of a sudden your brain just goes, nope, something's missing.
Yeah,
And
yeah, because you,
and
you
for
you
both of
almost
them,
take
I
a sip.
think, yeah, I think with both of them, it's the red oak. The impact of the red oak spice on both
Yeah,
of them, you tip it and go, nope, something missing.
yeah,
Right. That's
absolutely.
Jason, that's exactly what I I couldn't put my finger on before, and that's it. That's exactly it. It's like there's something missing. I don't, and I was like, I'm not so certain that it's the ABV, and that's what it is something's missing. So compared to everything else we tasted tonight. So yeah, I would love to go back and start with these tomorrow and see how I feel about it. And then, like you said, put it in my mind that those are the building blocks
Yeah,
for
for
everything
the others.
else. That's
So
fun.
the only reason I actually did do it in this direction is I'm always cautious of doing a cask strength first, and then your mouth becoming numb, and then you go down to 40. But like if you're trying them side by side, I would definitely recommend try the two and then try like the 12 or the 16, and you can see where they come from. So just to also shine a light on the Abuna itself rather than the Abuna Alba, this was the original. I said Aberlour Abuna Abuna Alba came around in 2019. Aberlour Abuna is like, I think it's on batch like 130 or 140. It's been around for almost 20 years, and it's 100% matured in Oloroso sherry casks. So you do end up getting, this definitely works better with the raw spirit that Aberlour produces. That fig, that dried fruit, the black cherries that are coming through. The Aberlour Abuna with the European red oak ex sherry casks is like the perfect complement for that already base spirit. So you get less of that battle of two flavors going on like you do in the Aberlour Abuna, where the Abuna does have this amazing, like buttery vanilla, tropical coconut lemon zest flavor, and it's quite, as you say, it almost catches you off guard when you try it, when you expect this sort of winter warmer flavor profile to come from Aberlour. The Abuna Alba is quite a stretch beyond that. Aberlour Abuna is, I said, cask and am is one of the closer ones to like the traditional goal of what Aberlour set out to create. In my opinion, Aberlour Abuna is what Aberlour as a brand really stands for. And then is this very, very strong sherry bomb. Of course, it is cask strength. So once again, please feel free if you are wanting to add any water. But really, that base spirit with those really quite strong, oily textures and that spicy winter fruit flavor that's coming through, paired with the marzipan and brown sugar of the sherry casks, all together just works in an incredible way. In fact, the best example I can give for this is our master blender, Sandy Islop in Scotland. When he drinks whiskey, he will actually, and this is when he's sampling and when he's drinking casually, but when he's sampling, he's using his nose and he tries by flavor, maybe like one in every 500 is what he claims. But when he's drinking casually, if he's made a whiskey, say it's Aberlour 12, and it's 40% ABV, he will mix it 50-50% with water, and he'll bring it down to 20% ABV with every single whiskey. He just likes it that way because he believes it allows him to get more of the flavour of the oils that are coming through and kind of reduce that alcohol percentage down. And that's just the way that Sandy enjoys drinking his whiskey. However, the only whiskey that he claims he never adds a single drop of water to is the Aberlour Abuna. So he brings everything else down to 20%, but the one that sits at 61% ABV is perfect as is. So he's a strong advocate for for this whiskey in particular, and I've seen through his Instagram many stories where there's a bottle of Aberlour Abuna, and a few hours later you see the same bottle empty on a different story. He's a big fan of this whiskey. I would highly, if you are interested in seeing kind of behind the scenes of the blending process, I would highly recommend giving him a follow on Instagram as well. His name is Whiskey Blender Dude. If you look him up on Instagram, you can kind of see the lab and how they all make these, and kind of behind the scenes of what's coming up in the pipeline. But I would, yeah, highly recommend checking him out.
This one is definitely not as jarring to me as the Alba, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
The Abuna
So
Alba, yeah, I think part of it is because the sherry is very complementary to the whiskey,
yeah,
whereas the
absolutely.
bourbon is a lot harsher. It's a much harsher. Um,
You do have that almost two roads of flavour in the album.
yeah,
There's a lot going on. Well, the two of them
yeah,
like really fuse together in flavour inside the in the
yeah,
Abuna itself, and they
yeah.
complement each other just amazingly.
Yeah, but it's so interesting now that we're tasting these two, like I said, these two side by side, and we understand this is what makes up all the other ones we tasted. Those are the building blocks. It's really interesting that, from these two you can get these others. That's
Yeah,
that's great.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
fun. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
don't like the Aberlour Abuna is and the Alba is released in batches. So you do actually get they're not wildly different in flavour, but you can sometimes taste from batch to batch a slight difference in flavour. So that also makes it interesting on the fact that when you think about the blending team going into the warehouse, they go in April of one year, they pull out 100 casks to make out Aberlour 12. They use those casks, which typically wouldn't happen. They might use like 20% of one and 30% of one, and then the rest goes back into the warehouse for a later date. But the next time they go in like September and they pull out 100 casks, they're dealing with 100 completely different flavors to the last time they created it, and their aim is to create the same flavor over and over again. So not only is it like breaking down the fact that these two bottles are the building blocks, but if you actually follow the batches over time, you're also seeing the variation within the building blocks, and they're still able to achieve the same flavor. I think, yeah, the two. I personally, and I don't know if I should admit this, I personally much prefer the Aberlour Abuna over the Alba. But I love being able to sit down and yeah, try them side by side, particularly when you have an example of what they're like when you bring them together as well.
It's somebody posted a question. They were asking roughly what age are the spirits in these things, because they're not age statements.
Yeah, so
Uh,
non-statement allows us to be far more creative with what we're able to produce. So the reason there's no age statement on it kind of dates back to the bottle that was found in the wall. There was actually no label on that, it was just a glass bottle. So the team didn't really know what they were using. They could have put an age statement on it, but it allows us to use, particularly in the example of like Abuna Alba, our 4 and 5 year old whiskies are going to create far more of that sharp, crisp, citrusy, really quite fresh flavour. By the time we get up to like the same barrel, but we leave it 5 more years, those crisp, citrusy flavours have developed out into more like floral, vanilla, more buttery, and the sweetness has started to come through. So it's quite a wide range, to answer the question, quite a wide range of ages that go into these bottles. We do have some whiskey that's like 4 and 5 years. We do have some whiskey that's like 10 and 12. I would say in both of them, there's probably not a whiskey over 14, 15 years old. That you've got a wide range of about 4 to 12 and everything in between.
But what I was actually going on is you were talking about if they pull out the barrel in April versus
Yeah,
they pull out the barrel in September. Then I mean, I gotta say, I think blending is this black magic, and those
yeah,
people are sorcerers, and I don't even know, how they do it. I'm always amazed. But if they're pulling them out in April, they could be pulling out a 5-year-old in April,
yeah,
and then, like, in September, they try to pull it out. The 5-year-old is just not at all the right thing, and they have to pull out a 12-year in September, or, I'm making
yeah.
all these numbers up, um, but I think that, that must go into some of what they're thinking when they pull these
Yeah,
barrels out and
absolutely.
try
And that
experimenting. Yeah.
that could definitely happen where they use like 30, 40% of a barrel and then they put it away. And then like they've noted where it is. And the next time they go to make it, they go and pull it out. But say that was quite close on months, but say it was like three batches later, and it'd been like a year or more since they pulled that barrel out, and they go in and try it, and it's matured in a way that they didn't expect. It might require them to like bring in another barrel intentionally to counteract what that has matured into, or even taking two other barrels from somewhere else in the warehouse and blending them to try replicate the flavor of what that tasted like a year ago before. So it is incredible in the way that they're, because they when they blend they do it on such a small scale as well. They're not doing it on like 22,000 liters. They're doing it on pretty much the size of a bottle, and they work out the recipe and then they scale it up to 22,000. So it's incredible when they're talking like some of these measurements must be in tiny, tiny milliliters that they're adding just to really tip it to make sure it's exactly the same as it was the last time they bottled it. And in the blending labs, they have these archive cupboards of all the bottles we've ever created. So we've got like the first Aberlour 12-year-old and the first Glenlivet 14-year-old, and they're there so that every time they go back to make it, when they have their final blend, they can bring out the original and try them side by side and make sure it actually tastes like the very, very first one. So it's never in a goal to make it taste like the last time we created it. It's every time we create it, we're making it to taste like the first time we created it. So it's yeah, it's all just about achieving that consistency.
All right. So before we lose everybody, let's go ahead. Anybody who's still on, let's take a picture and then I'll put up the poll. Uh, Thank you, Owen, for everything, and joining us once again and bringing really good whiskey. All right. Jim, you still there? Where is the button? Wait a second. All right. All right, everybody, on three. One, two, three. Cheers. Perfect. All right. Um, and our poll. What was your favorite of the night?
Am I allowed to vote?
Absolutely. But then you also have to guess what everyone else says.
Oh, okay, okay. That's a double-edged sword.
Now we had two of our people left, and one voted for the 18, one for the 16. I don't
Is
get to
a
vote.
It's a tough call.
I always think the funny thing with Aberlour is the fact that as a space side, it's not a sherry bomb, which actually can be a benefit because it doesn't have to compete with the sherry bombs.
Yeah,
Because there's already so many of them, why bother trying to fight in that war? But it
so
also I've noticed that I don't think of them, but I always like them, and it's one of those really nice things. It's like you hand it to me, I'm like, oh.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think especially like you're absolutely right. There's so many in the sherry bomb category, like Glenfarclas and Tamdhu and all of these whiskies. And then
Yeah.
with Macallan in the last couple of years, really steering a lot of their marketing towards the sherry influence within their expressions. It's made a lot of other brands kind of pull in that direction, and even brands that have never really focused on it have started coming out with these like new one-off expressions that seem to be there for a very, very long time, of like 100% sherry or very high sherry influences. So it's definitely becoming the sort of the trend of the industry at the moment as being these sherry casks. So it's good being a brand that's been doing it for much longer, but without
Yeah.
going like, right to the extreme of the sherry
All right.
matches.
I think we've got everybody. Owen, do you want to guess what you think everybody's favorite was for the night?
I'll take a stat. Like I'm just going to go for like what the number one voted favorite whiskey was.
Hmm.
I would go between a Buna and 18, and I'm going to say 18.
And the
Ah,
18.
proud of myself on that.
If I was actually voting, and not just on, not because it was my favorite drinking wise, but I think it was the most interesting, is really the Anthema.
Yeah, the final one.
Yeah, the Anthema is just different compared to. It's still enjoyable, but it's different from everything else Aberlour does.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I was glad when I saw that poll that I didn't go for that guess at 14%. I would have been, I wouldn't have been good. But
Mhm.
yeah,
I
no,
mean, the problem with these polls is we're only allowed to choose one, and
Yep.
I think everybody would love to be able to choose one, two, three,
yeah,
and even one,
Now,
two, three would have been a tough call, to be
and then you
honest.
were talking about the batches for Abana, and so I remembered I had at least one left, and yeah, mine is I've got one bottle left of 56, batch 56.
oh yes, that's the old label before we moved it down to the bottom.
And this is a
That
61.2. And smelling it, it's much sweeter than this one.
so there is you can notice a distinct difference between the batches. So that's
Yeah,
probably
and Trent had some good notes on that sumac and that paprika
yeah,
and a lot of things because the new one is more savory sherry and this one is more like if I had to think of it it's more PX-y and that sweetness
yeah.
at least on the nose.
Oh, what the older one that you've got
Yeah.
is
Yeah, the
PX.
older
Yeah,
one's a
yeah.
lot sweeter dessert. That sherry just kind of comes out.
So it's interesting that you say that. So we recently at the distillery itself, there's now a distillery exclusive, which is actually an Aberlour Abuna with a PX finish, which unfortunately only available at the distillery itself. But I saw that get posted, and I thought, man, I'm not going to be there. I'm not going to be there in time before that disappears. But yeah, I think the one that you have there must be like pre 2015 or 2016, if that aligns with
Somewhere
when.
around then, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, like that's a an incredible old batch to have. Now we're way up into the hundreds, having like one like the 50s is definitely a good piece to have in your collection.
All right. Does anybody have any questions before we stop sharing and then ask, the really important questions that no one can say publicly? All right. Thank you once again, everybody. Please join us again next time. For I think we've got next week is Westland, and I don't think he has launched anything else other than the Friendsgiving. For anyone that is actually local to the Los Angeles area, they're doing the annual Friendsgiving, and you can sign up for that in person.
Believe it or not, there might be somebody from Oregon that makes us all the way down there for
Hey,
that. Because my son lives right there anyway, so
well, that's
they'll
useful.
make it a double deal.
Nice. It'd be good to
All
see you
right.
in person.
Thank
Yeah.
you, everyone, and have a good evening.
Thanks.